Hello, and welcome to the third episode of the NextGen series presented by the National Veterans Network. For this episode, we are pleased to present the service of Terry Nakanishi, a Japanese-American female veteran who served in the Women's Army Corps during World War II. The contributions of Japanese-American women in the U.S. military are less known, but they, in fact, have a powerful and an inspiring story to tell. They upheld the same values as their male counterparts to demonstrate their loyalty and patriotism to the United States at a time when Japanese Americans were discriminated due to their race and ancestry. These Japanese American women were trailblazers who, despite discrimination and cultural barriers, paved the way for other women to serve and to demonstrate that they could accomplish anything that they set their mind to. For this episode, the National Museum of the U.S. Army's Chief of Exhibit, Paul Morando, will be speaking with two descendants of the Japanese-American World War II veterans. Joining Paul will be two seventh grade students, Alana, a student from Hawaii, and Yuki, a student from the state of Washington. Now let's take a look at the extraordinary life of Terry Nakanishi.
Hello, it's great to be talking with both of you today about Terry Nakanishi and her dog tags. And as a chief curator of the National Museum of the United States Army, it's my job to interpret objects like this, develop exhibits, and put on display so visitors can learn more about this story. And I know you have family members who've served in the military. Can you talk a little bit about them?
Yeah, so my grandpa, he served in the military, and my grandma served in the Navy, and my aunt served in the military, and my uncle served in the Air Force. So I have a lot of people in my family that served, and so it's fun. Like on Veterans Day at my school, they all come, and everyone's surprised on how many people served in my family.
My great-grandpa served in the 442. He volunteered to be in the 442nd, and then when the 100th ran short of men, he got asked to be in the 100th as well. My great-grandpa passed away when I was very young, so I didn't really know him. So I kind of wanted to do this to learn more about what he could have done in the Army. And my family is really proud of all his things that he did. And it's a very big tradition, or not tradition, but legacy in our family.
So today, one of the objects that is located in the Nisei soldier experience, the ID tags or dog tags that belong to Terry Nakanishi. Terry Toyome Nakanishi was born in 1921 in Idaho and spent her early childhood in Montana, where her stepfather worked for the Union Pacific Railroad. Terry was raised in a strict bilingual household where the American way and education were emphasized. After public school each day, she also went to Japanese language school. She liked spending time outdoors, playing baseball, marbles, ice skating, and sledding. During her teenage years, her family moved back to Idaho. It was a hard time for Terry and her family as they faced discrimination due to their Japanese ancestry. Then on December 7th, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor.
How old is Terry?
Right. Well, how old was she when she joined the Army? Well, Terry was 22 years old when she enlisted in the Women's Army Corps.
What motivated her to join the Army?
Well, Terry always wanted to serve. She had a passion for serving. She wanted to help people, and she wanted to do it. She really wanted to be a nurse growing up. And when she tried to join the Women's Army Corps, she was not allowed to do so because there was a ban on Japanese Americans joining the Women's Army Corps. When that ban was lifted, she was able to join and serve in that capacity.
What kind of work did Terry do for the Army?
Well, yeah, she actually had a lot of different jobs in the Army. After basic training, she worked actually in the Ordnance Department, helping process requests to send vehicles overseas for the war. And then she was reassigned to the Military Intelligence Service. In fact, she was among the first group of Nisei women selected to attend the Military Intelligence Service Language School at Fort Snelling, Minnesota. And then she served overseas during the occupation of Japan. So this is after the war, right? And she worked in a headquarters department, doing all different types of work, from being a translator to supporting that type of work in Japan.
In the picture that was presented, was she in that picture?
You can see right there. Yes. I think this is just a fantastic photo. So you can see not only Terry, but her fellow soldiers from the Women's Army Corps.
That's cool.
Mm-hmm.
How many women along with Terry were in the Army?
Yeah, good question. There were 80 Nisei female who served in the Women's Army Corps. So that's not a lot in comparison to the amount of women who served throughout the Women's Army Corps. About 150,000, right, who served in the Women's Army Corps during that time. So Terry was quite, remarkable in that aspect, that, being a Nisei a woman and serving is quite remarkable. And in some ways, she overcame sort of the stereotype back then that Japanese American women could serve in the Army, because that wasn't really a typical path that Japanese American women took back during that time, right? And opportunities for women were not, there were not a lot of opportunities. So in some ways, she was a pioneer, and maybe, was a role model for others who came after her.
Was it hard for women to get into the Army?
Right. So during Terry's time frame, women were not allowed in the Army. So the Women's Army Corps, that's where they served. And a lot of times they served in support roles, and for Nisei women, they served in different capacities, like the MIS, and other areas, administrative work, medical field. So initially women were not allowed in the United States Army, but they served obviously overseas in other capacity. And like I said before, over 150,000 women served during World War II, including Nisei women. And Terry wore these dog tags during her service in the Women's Army Corps from 1944 to 1946.
And why did they use the dog tag for identification? And what kind of information was on the dog tag?
Yeah. Typically, you would have the name of the person on the dog tag or the ID tag. Information like their military ID number. So kind of like your social security number that we all have now. So before 1969, the Army used a military ID number, not a social security number. So that would have been on her dog tag. Also, you would have a blood type, and that information is important to medics or medical personnel. If you become wounded on the battlefield and you need, to be given blood, you want to make sure they know the right blood type. and also sometimes the religious preference. You can see this image of Terry's dog tag. You can see some of that information is on there.
I have one question. What did Terry do after the war?
Well, after the war, Terry returned to the United States and settled in Monterey, California. She and her husband Toshio Lefty Nakanishi, who served in the United States Army's Counterintelligence Corps, started a family and had 2 sons. As I mentioned before, Terry always wanted to become a nurse, right? So she devoted her time volunteering at the Red Cross and Fort Ord Hospital, which brought her great joy. So in some ways, Terry and her, fellow female soldiers, challenged the sort of World War II stereotypes about Japanese Americans and women. So she, in some way, pursued a very non-traditional path in joining the Army or the military with her military service. And what she did, maybe unknowingly, but still did, was prove that Japanese American women could play an important role in protecting the United States or a nation's interests, and by serving in this capacity.
I think it's cool that she was one of the first Nisei women to join the WWII, because that's like a very big thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Yuki.
I think that she had an important role because right when, like you said, right when the barrier where women weren't allowed to be in the Army, she was, like Alana said, one of the first women to join. So I think she had an important role in the Army.
Absolutely, and she did it in a somewhat quiet way, right? But impactful as well, and can inspire other women after her to join the Army as well. So I want to thank you both, Yuki and Alana, for joining me today to kind of have a discussion about Terry Nakanishi and her role in the Women's Army Corps and the dog tags. So I hope to see you at the museum someday, where we can continue our conversation, not only about the Nisei objects, but other objects that are in the museum as well. So thank you and take care.
Thank you.
Now, some of you may not know the history of women in the U.S. Armed Forces. And so to provide that information or that historical background, it is my pleasure to introduce my friend, Tracy Bradford, who is the director of the U.S. Army Women's Museum at Fort Lee, Virginia.
Here at the Army Women's Museum, it's an honor to share the stories of women like Terry Nakanishi, who served during this unprecedented time in our country's history, and who were trailblazers for all Army women who followed. Upon entering the war in 1941, American political and military leaders quickly understood that women could supply the additional manpower desperately needed in the armed forces. The Women's Army Corps, or WWII, was established to bring women's knowledge, skill, and special training to the Army. Originally, only a small number of traditionally feminine positions, such as cooks and clerks, were open to women. But after a few short months, over 400 military occupations were deemed suitable for WWICs. By 1943, WWICs were already assigned to every major Army command in the United States and to 2 active overseas theaters. This same year, the War Department allowed Japanese American women to enter the Women's Army Corps. These women, as well as Hispanic, African American, and other Asian American women, volunteered to serve in a segregated army and often faced prejudice and inequality. Ultimately, over 200,000 women served at home and abroad in the Women's Army Corps during World War II, and their contributions forever changed the Army and the nation. While the original intent of opening the military to women was to support the war effort, The contributions and accomplishments of these trailblazers were recognized with legislation that was established to create a lasting presence of women in the military. Their legacy lives on today with girls like Yuki, who is a descendant of generations of women who served in the armed forces.